Okay, and hello and welcome to ADAA's professional webinar featuring Dr. Janina Scarlett, Superhero Therapy, combining evidence-based therapy with pop culture narratives to help clients heal. Thank you so much for joining us today. Please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat and let us know where you're joining us from. My name is Sasha Sicard. I'm the Associate Director of Education and Membership Engagement here at ADAA, and I will be your host. I would like to note that this webinar is being recorded, and for all those who have applied for CE credit, you will receive an email with the link and instructions at the end of the session. If you have any questions, please reach out to webinars@adaa.org. We will be doing a Q&A at the end of the presentation, so please feel free to submit your questions and comments at any times, and we will address them at the end. I would like to introduce our wonderful presenter, Dr. Scarlett. She is a licensed clinical psychologist, author, TEDx speaker, and wonderful full-time geek. She is a Ukrainian-born refugee who immigrated to the US at the age of 12 with her family. She is the recipient of the Eleanor Roosevelt Human Rights Award by the United Nations Associations for her work on superhero therapy, which we'll be going over today. Her work has been featured in many places, and she regularly consults on books and television shows, including HBO's The Young Justice. We are so excited to have her here today, and I'm going to hand over the presentation to her. Dr. Scarlett, you can go ahead.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much, Sasha. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you're joining us from today. Thank you. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. I am absolutely honored to be spending this hour with you. So just for the sake of transparency, I do want to let you know that I am the CEO of Superhero Therapy. I am compensated for workshops and talks related to this topic. I also have books and podcasts and YouTube and TikToks and things like that related to this topic. So I did want to be open and transparent about that. So as somebody who, as Sasha mentioned, is a full-time geek, I am very interested in stories, and people have been using stories ever since the spoken word. People have been using stories to help one another to understand trauma, to understand relationships, to understand life, and to understand loss. And in my study of stories, what I've discovered is that every single person, real or fictional, has an origin story of their own. And my origin story began in Ukraine. And in over a decade, almost 12 years actually, of doing this work, this is one of the first times where I don't feel like I have to explain where Ukraine is. And so in my case, I was born and raised in Ukraine in this beautiful city called Vinnytsia. And when I was just a few months shy of my third birthday, there was a massive explosion at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. And so I usually joke that I'm waiting for my spidey senses or, Hulk-like superpowers. But in my case, as in the case of many people in Ukraine, I spent a lot of time in and out of hospitals. Acute radiation poisoning almost entirely shut down my immune system, so it couldn't fight even a simple cold. And to this day, some of the side effects that still exist are that whenever the weather changes, I get severe migraines, which sometimes turn to seizures. And when I was 12 years old, my family and I moved to the United States. So at this point, I was in 7th grade. I don't know how many of you remember being in 7th grade, but I usually joke that we need to start some kind of an I survived 7th grade support group. So, if at some point we have maybe an extra hour at ADAA, maybe we can share our middle school horror stories. But in my case, at 12 years old, by the time I reached 12 years old, I'd been through abuse, assault, bullying, the trauma of severe chronic health issues and the trauma of immigration. As somebody that came from a radioactive country, as somebody that didn't speak English, as somebody that didn't know about American culture, I made a very easy bullying target. And so, although I knew that other kids were being bullied, because nobody in my school talked about mental health, I erroneously assumed that I was the only one that was going through depression and anxiety and panic attacks and trauma, but I didn't have terms for these. And so the only thing I could understand was that there's something that was wrong with me. And I thought that there was something that was broken about me. Now, things did start getting better when I got to high school and my English got better, but I kept feeling like an outsider. That feeling had never left. And if we're being honest, that feeling had never left. That feeling is still here today. But there was a moment in my high school history that forever changed the way I understood stories and the way I understood the feeling of being an outsider. And that was when I saw the first X-Men movie. So I was 16 years old and I was working in a movie theater, and we were invited to see the midnight screening of the X-Men. And from the moment the film began, I felt like I could relate to it. The movie starts out with us seeing a little boy being dragged away from his parents who are being taken to a concentration camp. And all four of my grandparents had been in the Holocaust. And so immediately I was like, what is this? It's supposed to be a superhero movie, but it's so real. And the movie, in case you're not familiar with the X-Men, is about these fictional heroes, mutants to be exact, each of which has some kind of a genetic mutation. And most of them had been through something really traumatic in order to arrive there. For example, this guy, Wolverine, not only does he have these claws that protrude from his hands that can be used as weapons, but he has a healing factor. And he received these super abilities after going through years of torture and experimentation. But it was ultimately Storm that caught my attention. So most of my life, especially after Chernobyl radiation, my health effects would be impacted by weather changes. And so I felt controlled by the weather. But Storm has the ability to control the weather herself. And somehow seeing her on the screen made me feel empowered. But more so, as I kept watching, I was seeing characters who had experienced depression, trauma, bullying, alienation, and excruciating loneliness. And I felt like I could speak to each and every one of them. I felt like each and every one of them had a piece of my heart. As I was watching this film for the first time in my life, I rethought my own origin story. And instead of thinking of myself as a victim, I started thinking of myself as a survivor. And I started realizing that maybe it wasn't that there was something broken about me or that I was an outsider. Maybe it's that each and every one of us feels like an outsider, but we don't talk about it. Maybe it's that we try so hard to fit in that we don't realize that what we're ultimately yearning for is a sense of belonging. And maybe if we can take off our masks, and maybe if we can be honest about how lonely we are, then maybe we can feel like we belong. And so it was because of this film that I was having all these epiphanies. And I was looking around this completely full, completely sold out movie theater. It was a midnight showing on a weekday. Not a single seat empty, not a single dry eye in the room. And I realized that every single person in that movie theater knew what it was like to feel lonely. And so, because of this film, I decided to go into psychology. So, it was after seeing it that I signed up for my first ever psychology class in high school and never looked back. And so now I specialize in incorporating stories as a vehicle to help people understand their own trauma experiences to help people to understand their own origin story so that they can reduce the stigma about their own experiences and find hope and healing. Now, I'm going to be talking about trauma a lot in this talk. You don't have to be a PTSD specialist to be working with trauma, because if you're working with people, you're working with trauma. And I saw that when I was working at Camp Pendleton for my postdoctoral training. So I was doing my postdoc in San Diego, California, working with active duty Marines who just returned from Afghanistan and Iraq. And no matter what their experiences were, majority of them blamed themselves for developing PTSD. Majority of them would say something along the lines of, I wanted to be Superman and I failed. And it would just break my heart, because these were individuals who had been through some of the worst traumatic experiences you can think of, and yet blamed themselves for developing PTSD. And so I started using Socratic questions. I was using cognitive processing therapy, CPT, as a treatment modality. And I started using Socratic questions to challenge their thoughts. So I would ask, is Superman truly invincible, or does he have any kind of vulnerability? And of course, many of them knew the answer. So they would say, well, Superman is vulnerable to kryptonite, and when he's around kryptonite, it weakens his powers. So I would ask them, okay, well, if Superman is vulnerable to kryptonite, does that make him any less of a superhero? Now, they would be quick to jump to his defense, right? They would say, no, of course not. What are you talking about? And I would wait. I'd give them a moment to figure it out. So there'd be a pause between us, and usually followed by a pretty obvious light bulb moment, and then a smile. And then they would say, ah, I see what you did there, right? Because the truth is that every single hero that we look up to, be it real or fictional, has some kind of kryptonite, has some kind of vulnerability. But it's not despite of it that we care, it's because of it, right? Like, I don't know about the rest of you, but I don't want to see a movie about some super powered or overpowered superhero that has no obstacles, that easily defeats every villain. That would be boring, right? I want to see a movie about somebody that barely makes it through, that is clinging on by their teeth and nails, but shows up anyway because it's so important. In other words, a superhero just like each and every one of our clients, and perhaps a superhero just like every one of you, because I know that there are days when you're barely hanging on and you're showing up just like a superhero. And so what I saw was that after clients were able to make this connection, that even the heroes they look up to have a vulnerability and have been through some kind of a traumatic origin, they were able to feel less ashamed about going through a mental health issue. They were able to talk about their experiences, often using metaphors. They would say, you know how I felt when my friend was killed in front of me? I felt like little Bruce Wayne, Batman, when his parents were killed in front of him. I felt small. I felt defenseless. I felt like there was nothing I could do to stop it. And it made sense to them, and it made sense to me. And I didn't always know all the references they were making, but I could understand the point that they were making in a language that made sense to them. And I view pop culture as a part of my client's culture. Pop culture has now spread all over the world. There are comic conventions in every single country, including Saudi Arabia. People dress up as their favorite characters, whether they're heroes or villains or anti-heroes, as a way of show their dedication to their favorite part of pop culture. Popular culture has become the modern mythology. And I believe that as a part of being a culturally sensitive therapist, it is my job to understand my client's culture. And so this is where superhero therapy came from. Superhero therapy refers to incorporating stories from pop culture, books, TV shows, movies, and video games into evidence based therapy, whichever modality you already use. So CBT, ACT, DBT, doesn't matter, EMDR, to help clients become their own version of a superhero in real life, IRL. And it's intended to be for people of all ages, not only for children. It's been utilized with teenagers and adults. I am now consulting with providers all over Ukraine to help individuals who are going through atrocities and trauma of the war to understand their own trauma through superhero lens. And it is something that for a lot of people has been not only destigmatizing, but also hope building. And the most important rule of superhero therapy, if you take nothing else away from this talk, please just remember this one slide. You don't have to be a pop culture expert to do this work. Your client is the expert in pop culture. All you have to be is open-minded and curious. That's it. And the reason why this work can be so important is because during the most difficult times, people tend to feel alone, especially when facing trauma. They might feel like nobody can understand them. And when that happens, they might start feeling ashamed. When people feel ashamed and alone in their experience, they're more likely to withdraw from other people, avoid support systems, avoid talking about what happened to them, which we know maintains PTSD. In fact, avoidance is the top factor maintaining symptoms of PTSD. People are more likely to take blame on themselves for what happened. They're more likely to avoid with substances. They're more likely to feel hopeless and helpless, and more likely to consider suicide if they're feeling lonely and ashamed. Loneliness is something that I've been really interested in, especially over the past decade, because I see superhero therapy as sort of the balm for loneliness. Loneliness, especially perceived loneliness, doesn't mean being physically alone in a space. It means feeling emotionally disconnected from another person. So that's the word perceived here. It means that we believe that other people don't understand what we're going through, or maybe don't want to understand. It's when we feel unseen, unheard, and invalidated. And it's this kind of perceived loneliness that has been tied to a sharp increase in cardiovascular risk factors, higher risk in Alzheimer's disease in individuals who are susceptible to these illnesses, increased mental health pathology, including suicide attempts, and also assumptions of worthlessness and burdensomeness, which are risk factors for suicide. Increased inflammation and immune problems and immune diseases, including fibromyalgia. Higher risk of chronic pain, including migraines and stomach aches, and higher risk of premature mortality in older adults. Loneliness has become a modern day invisible epidemic, according to the United States Surgeon General, Dr. Vivek Murthy, as he describes in his book, Together. Loneliness has been dubbed the new smoking, where meta-analyses are finding that people who are going through frequent experience of loneliness, and we don't mean physical isolation here, we mean that perceived social isolation, have as high of a health risk as people with chronic smoking, that's smoking a minimum of 15 cigarettes per day, and chronic alcohol abuse. Now, not in terms of lung disease or liver disease, but in terms of heart health, autoimmune problems, and immune health altogether. In fact, loneliness seems to target the very same pain receptors as physical pain. So much so that people who are lonely are more likely to experience physical pain. And people who are lonely, if they're able to take some kind of a painkiller like Tylenol or aspirin, report decreased physical pain and decreased loneliness rates. Now, this does not mean that we should be suggesting Tylenol to our patients who are experiencing loneliness. This means that we need to look at loneliness as a pervasive problem in our society. And the latest statistics suggest that 1 in every 5 people that comes to their emergency room is struggling with loneliness as one of the main presenting factors. I want to tell you about the study that I found absolutely fascinating. So researchers brought in a group of female participants who all consented to be in the study. And these women were asked to go into an MRI, and they were told that they would see certain pictures on the screen. These were not the actual images used in the experiment. And that at different parts of the experiment, they would know that an electric shock is coming, and then they would receive a mild electric shock. And this would be equivalent to getting a flu shot, for example. So it was painful, but not excruciating. There were 3 conditions in the study. In one of the conditions, the participants went on this treatment as usual, if you will. They were in an MRI, they would see a particular picture to indicate a shock is coming. They would receive the shock. They would be asked to report their levels of pain, and also the researchers would measure the pain activation in the pain centers of the brain. In the second condition, there was a kind, compassionate stranger that would hold the participant's hand during this part. So it would be either a nurse or a research assistant that would hold the participant's hand. And what the researchers found was when a stranger held the participant's hand, not only their reported pain levels were lower, but the activation in the pain centers of the brain was lower. The shock was the same. The actual administered shock was the same, but the activation in the pain centers of the brain reduced. Now, remember, I said there were 3 conditions. A third condition had a spouse or a romantic partner or a close friend, a loved one, holding the person's hand. And when that happened, their pain rates reduced even further. Again, not only verbally reported pain rates, but the activation in the pain centers of the brain, suggesting that receiving emotional or physical support reduces not only our mental suffering, it reduces our physical suffering too. Scientists are now suggesting that when we feel a sense of belonging, we're able to experience inverse effects to that of perceived loneliness, including increase of endogenous, our internal opiates, our pain-killing hormones, chemicals, and increase in oxytocin levels. That's the bonding hormone, where we feel that sense of belonging. And what we've learned over the past 2 years of the global pandemic is that belonging does not have to happen in person. What that means is that when we're able to receive support through virtual support groups, see a therapist online, have virtual dinners, or as we're starting to learn, perhaps see a reflection of ourselves in a fictional film or a TV show. It creates a plethora of wonderful mental health and physical health benefits. And that's improved health, improved immune functioning, improved cardiovascular strength, all the opposite effects of loneliness, improved mood, increased longevity. I thought this was absolutely fascinating. We know that when people go through some kind of traumatic life change, for example, loss of a spouse, a loss of a child, we know that they're at higher risk for premature death, including higher risk of what's called a broken heart syndrome. We saw that last week when the spouse of a teacher who died in the Uvalde attack in Texas died from broken heart syndrome after his wife was killed. What happens in a broken heart syndrome is that the heart is so overwhelmed with grief and pain that it literally changes shape. It becomes oval from the influx of emotional and physical pain. But we see no such risk factors when individuals have meaningful social supports. In fact, studies are finding that oxytocin can be essentially used as a healing factor. Because I'm a nerd, I like to call it a magic potion to help us build our physical and mental health. Oxytocin is a hormone that's involved in bonding, recognition of kin, affection, childbirth, orgasm, breastfeeding, and very importantly, stress resilience and recovery. So when we receive meaningful social support, our bodies release oxytocin. But when we give meaningful social support, our bodies give us that same reward. Our bodies give us oxytocin too when we're helping somebody else. We have this built-in reward system for helping other people. That means that we're wired for being altruistic. And for those of you who are caretaking for other people, for those of you who are in the mental health field, for those of you that are helping people on a regular basis, you literally oxytocin for a living. And what that means is that what you already do for a living, or maybe in your personal life, such as taking care for a family member, is making you stronger and healthier and is expanding your lifespan. How cool is that? That what you already do is making you healthier. And we know that, of course, we can receive additional oxytocin boost from friendships, from connection. But does it have to be in person? Does it have to be in real life, perhaps? And as we're starting to talk about it, the answer is no. We're starting to see more and more evidence that parasocial relationships, so that means one-sided relationships with, let's say, fictional characters, serve as social surrogates for people. They can become a surrogate friend, family member, or even a support group when such support groups are missing in that individual's life. For many people who are going through trauma, they might lack the vocabulary and the skills to understand their traumatic experiences. This is where superhero therapy can allow clients to understand their traumatic experiences through the lens of something they're already familiar with, through the language they already understand, the language of popular culture. So in framing trauma or the onset of panic attacks or anxiety as an origin story, we can help that client to understand that this is not the end, this is the beginning, this is the jumping off point. Every superhero has an origin story, just like Batman, just like Wonder Woman or Wanda Maximoff from the Avengers, just like Harry Potter or Luke Skywalker. This may be your origin story, but this doesn't define you. What actions you take are entirely up to you. So I want to show you how this could be incorporated into therapy. So here's a case study. A few years ago, I was working with, at that time, 17-year-old girl whose parents brought her in for severe social anxiety and depression. We're going to call this young lady Emily. Emily was adopted along with her older sister. The two were initially separated when they were little, when they were going from foster care to foster care, and then were adopted together by loving, wonderful parents. At the time I started working with Emily, she had been separated from her sister again when her older sister went to live in a residential treatment facility. When this happened, Emily showed significant behavioral regression. She started playing with toys that she hadn't played with since she was a small child, and she completely shut down. When her mom brought her in, her mom said that Emily spends most of her time in her bedroom watching anime on her phone. Now, I know quite a bit about superheroes and fantasy, but I don't know a lot about anime. So I was completely new to this. And so I asked Emily's mom, what anime does Emily like to watch? And her mom didn't exactly know. So I asked Emily, so what anime do you like to watch? What's one that you watch over and over? And she said she likes to watch Demon Slayer. So at this point, I knew absolutely nothing about Demon Slayer. So I said, can you tell me about it? And I took notes. So Emily told me that Demon Slayer is about these two kids, a boy named Tanjiro and a girl named Nezuko. Tanjiro's, most of their family was killed by an evil demon who killed their parents and their siblings. And Nezuko, the sister, was bit by the demon. So she's in the process of transforming. And if she bites a human, then she's going to become a demon. So that's why Tanjiro put this kind of a bamboo muzzle over his sister's mouth to prevent her from turning into a demon. Because of this, he decides to become a demon slayer. He risks his life to hunt demons to look for a cure for his sister. So we spent a couple of sessions talking about the show, and I asked Emily to tell me a little bit about the characters. I asked her to summarize the show for me, summarize some of the episodes. And after a while, I started seeing some parallels in the show that she was describing and in her life. And I asked her, hey, is there a character that you feel a strong sense of connection with? Maybe a character that you feel like understands you if you could talk to them. And she said, well, I guess Tanjiro, the boy, because he will do anything to help his sister. And his sister is fighting her own inner demons. And I said, does that feel like what you're going through? And she said, I guess so. She said it feels like her own sister is fighting her own demons too. And she said that she wants to do everything possible to become a demon slayer to help her sister fight her demons. So I said, okay, well, let's imagine that you could be your own version of a demon slayer, IRL, in real life. What would that look like? And she said she would help her sister overcome her demons, as she called them, of anxiety and depression and all the reasons why her sister had to go to residential treatment. And I said, okay, so what might that look like? How might you be able to help? What are some actions you can take now if you are, in fact, a demon slayer? And she thought about it. And it turned out that her sister had written some letters to her and sent them to Emily, but Emily had been too scared to open them. She thought it would be too painful to read these letters. So I said, what would Tanjiro do? Like, what would you do as a demon slayer if you were like Tanjiro? And Emily thought about it and she said, I guess I would read the letters. And if it was Tanjiro, he would probably write back. So in the following session, she brought the letters. We read them together and she wrote back. She agreed to have some game nights with her family, and she also agreed to watch episodes of Demon Slayer with her family where they could talk about what she was going through the lens of the characters that they were watching. And toward the end of our work together, this is what Emily said. When my dog died, I didn't cry. When my aunt died, I didn't cry. But when someone dies in anime, it's like a balloon that explodes all of a sudden, and then you just cry. It's like all the tears I've been holding back that entire time finally explode. That made a lot of sense to me. A lot of children who grow up in difficult environments, especially adoptees, people who've been adopted, might not feel safe enough to feel their feelings, to cry when someone died. They might feel like they have to keep their emotions at bay. They might keep people and attachments at bay. But fictional characters are safe because fictional characters won't let you down. You know where they're coming from, and they're not going to betray your trust. And so a lot of people, especially people with a history of trauma, and especially people who are neurodivergent, might be more likely to identify with fictional characters. That's not to say that neurotypical people don't, they do. But my point is, you might see a lot of people who are neurodivergent having an easier time talking about anime characters and understanding anime characters' emotions than other people's emotions. In anime, characters' emotions are big. They're not hidden between the lines. They're not subtle. So if somebody's crying, they're crying buckets and buckets of tears, right? If somebody's in love, you see hearts coming out of them, like in any other cartoon, really. And for some neurodivergent individuals, they report that it's easier for them to understand emotions of others, and therefore easier for them to understand big emotions that they feel and the transparency about certain things. A lot of people report that in anime and in other movies and television shows and in books, they see a representation of that which they're not able to discuss with others rather. So for example, some people might see characters who are in the LGBTQIA community. And maybe this individual is in a country or in a community where they're not allowed to discuss being a part of this community. Maybe somebody is hiding their LGBTQIA identity, their sexual orientation, or their gender identity, but they might see a representation of, let's say, a gay character or a trans character or a non-binary character in a book or a TV show, and they might feel seen. And then they might see that they matter. And this kind of representation is the opposite of loneliness. That builds that very level of belonging and perceived social connection that we were talking about. Social connection creates this level of common humanity, this understanding that we're not alone, the understanding that who we are matters. It destigmatizes the client's experience, and it builds hope and meaning. Certain research studies that have looked at parasocial relationships, so those one-sided relationships with fictional characters, have found that when people feel lonely, they're more likely to turn to rewatching TV shows that they've already seen, like Friends, for example, or Supernatural, or another TV show where they feel a connection with characters, not to escape, but to connect. And similarly, when people feel lonely, if they write about an academic achievement versus when they write about a beloved character, they feel differently. They don't feel less lonely when they write about an academic achievement, but they feel significantly less lonely when they write about a beloved character, suggesting that when people feel lonely, they're not looking for a self-esteem boost. They're looking for connection. Research related to Harry Potter is finding that fantasy books like Harry Potter boosts compassion, especially compassion toward typically stigmatized groups like LGBTQIA groups, homeless individuals, and immigrants. Recent studies are finding that Spider-Man can be used to reduce arachnophobia. So watching Spider-Man movies can help people feel less afraid of spiders. So I was always wondering what Harry Potter's friend Ron Weasley, who was terrified of spiders, would be like if he ever met Spider-Man. Maybe that would help him. I guess the truth is we'll never know. But in all reality, last year I worked with an individual, we'll call him Jake. That's not his real name. Jake is a 22-year-old neurodivergent gay male who is struggling with severe arachnophobia and trauma history. Jake is a huge Harry Potter fan. And when his arachnophobia became worse, he struggled watching his favorite Harry Potter films. And so we started with watching Into the Spider-Verse. So it's a cartoon about Spider-Man that has many different spiders and Spider-Man in it, many different versions of Spider-Man from different universes. And so because it was a cartoon and it was about a superhero, Spider-Man, Jake was more willing to watch it. When he came back, he said that he was surprised at how tolerant he was of this exposure. Then we started watching small clips of Harry Potter films, which featured spiders, including toward the end of our treatment together, this big guy right here, Aragog. This is a huge spider in the Harry Potter films that actually attacks humans. We practiced a ridiculous spell, I call it. So in Harry Potter, we learn that certain monsters are called boggarts. Boggarts are shape-shifting monsters that can turn into a representation of something that you're afraid of. So for Ron, Harry's friend who is afraid of spiders, his shape-shifting monster, his boggart, turned into a big spider. And the way that you face a boggart is that you make it ridiculous. The spelling is this way on purpose. And so you make it ridiculous by making it silly. So for example, in the Harry Potter books, or in the movies rather, Ron imagines the spider on roller skates to make it silly. And so with Jake, we started looking at pictures of Aragog here and drawing little bow ties and putting a cake in front of it, sort of like offering a cake to the spider. And so we practiced a number of different ways of making this exercise ridiculous, eventually leading to him being able to watch one of the scariest depictions, which was the Chamber of Secrets film, Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets, which features a lot of big and scary, creepy, crawly spiders. Um, Superhero therapy is something that has been utilized for burnout prevention, where medical students can watch Scrubs, for example, as part of their clinical training to remind them of their core values, as well as to work on resilience and burnout prevention. This is a study that just came out last year that's finding that TV shows such as a sitcom, situation comedy, Scrubs is so helpful for one of the top medical issues that we're facing, especially in healthcare field. Undergraduate students who are exposed to trauma appear to have stronger feelings of connection to parasocial relations, to fictional characters, than to their classmates. But if their classmate is, for example, wearing a superhero t-shirt, or maybe is able to talk to them about maybe similar fandom, so similar franchise, then those classmates are likely to build trust faster. And so what it turns out is that finding similarities helps people to trust one another sooner. Now, as that trust starts to build, oxytocin levels rise. That's when that sense of belonging goes up. That's when we feel less physical and emotional pain. That's when we feel that sense of connection. And in therapy, this can be a difference between somebody quitting prematurely because they're overstimulated and somebody having the willingness to talk about their traumatic experiences and to work on exposures or some of the most challenging therapy exercises so that they're able to maintain treatment and be able to see the outcomes that we're hoping for. And so we need to help clients to make therapy as non-threatening and as approachable as possible. And it might mean that we need to be flexible in our approaches, still incorporating the very kind of modality that you use, whatever your theoretical orientation is. We can incorporate the client's own interests, the client's own culture into therapy to help client find a strength and build on their core values. Using stories like Harry Potter, Star Wars, and Avengers, we can help clients to be motivated to start taking steps toward changing, toward inspiring hope. And we know that when people hide away from their trauma, they're more likely to feel shame, and therefore they're likely to experience worsened symptoms. But when we know that when people start sharing their experiences or see a reflection of themselves in another person, whether it's in group therapy or as we're starting to learn in a fictional character, they're likely to feel less ashamed, less stigmatized, and be more likely to communicate about what they're going through, therefore more likely to process what happened to them. Superhero therapy can help to reduce that shame, that stigma, by pointing out that even superheroes have vulnerabilities, whether it's anxiety, panic attacks, trauma, etc. Seeing how fictional characters process grief, loss, and trauma can inspire our clients to do the same, can inspire our clients to make meaning out of what happened to them, and maybe inspire them to give back. Because it is that meaning making and giving back that is the biggest predictor of reduced symptomatology and post-traumatic growth. So the ways that we can incorporate superhero therapy into treatment, into whatever modality you're using, is to help our clients identify their origin stories as an origin story, whether it's an actual traumatic experience or the onset of their troubles. For example, the onset of their drinking, the onset of their bullying, the onset of their depression or their panic attacks, the start of their cancer. That's an origin story. Helping our clients to find the willingness to feel difficult emotions and internal experiences, and finding ways to connect in terms of making meaning out of what happened to them, reconnecting with friends and hobbies, and taking actions to give back to their community. This is a superhero therapy model that I've created in terms of what it might look like in treatment. So for many of our clients, something started with an origin story, right? Their life was going in a certain direction and then it went in a different direction. Now, sometimes this happens when the client is first born or even before they're born, as in cases of intergenerational trauma, for example. But for whatever reason, whatever happened to the client or maybe happened to their ancestors has affected who they are and how they feel. Because of this, the client might develop certain internal monsters. So this means certain undesirable internal sensations, feelings like anxiety or depression, for example, or memories or sensations that they wish to avoid or run away from. The more they avoid those feelings, sensations, and memories, the more setbacks they have and the more helpless and hopeless they feel. And so clients might on their own start looking for a heroic role model, or maybe we can help them find one. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. For example, Batman or Wonder Woman. Then the client would go through certain skills and training. This is your theoretical orientation, right? So whether it's thought challenging or mindfulness or whatever skills you already use or EMDR, just with a little bit of pop culture vocabulary sprinkled into it. And we help the client to define their sense of purpose, right? Who are you? What kind of a hero or a person do you want to be? And then we help them to take steps toward becoming their own version of a superhero in real life. So for Emily, it was writing a letter to her sister. For somebody else, it might be sharing their story or maybe creating entertaining content to help people in their community. So how do we do this? How do we start this process? Well, it starts with helping the client to define and tell their own origin story. We know that telling and retelling somebody's story helps to reduce their symptomatology. And so what we would do is we would help the client to write out their origin story. This is an example from Batman, where little Bruce Wayne witnessed the death of his parents. We would help the client to write out maybe first the bullet points of their origin story, and then over time, the origin story itself. As people tell and retell their origin story, oftentimes we see a desensitization of it, and it helps people to make sense of what happened to them. The second part is identifying a personal hero. This could be a real life hero. So, for example, this is one of my real life heroes here on the right. This is Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky. It could be a historical figure, a spiritual figure, or a fictional character like Black Panther or Wonder Woman. And so for an individual, they might want to think about a compassionate figure, somebody who is wise and caring. For some people, they might never have had a figure like it, but thinking about what kind of presence would they like to have in their life might be helpful. And then for the third part, the individual would be asked to imagine that they have a few moments alone with their hero. The hero already understands what they've been through. So let's say it's Wonder Woman. She already knows what you've been through. She knows your origin story. She knows your hopes and dreams and aspirations, and she knows your imposter syndromes and the mistakes you've made and your fumbles. And she has the most compassionate, encouraging words of inspiration for you. What might she say? And I encourage my clients actually to write it down or perhaps to draw it, to have first an internalized experience of it, and then if they're willing to read it out loud. This entire exercise from origin story to hero to the hero's message can take several sessions. We just talked about it in 2 minutes, but it can take several sessions to complete. And the idea would be for the client to have their hero in their corner at all times. They can have more than one hero. For one day, they might wish to talk to Wonder Woman. Another day, they might wish to talk to their grandfather, even if their grandfather is no longer alive. But really channeling that inner wisdom that they already have to receive the very words of encouragement and compassion that they're looking for, that other people in their life might not be able to provide. And once the person starts being more willing to talk about what happened to them, and once they have this support through either a real life or a fictional hero, we can start thinking about their sense of purpose. And that means, what kind of a person do you want to be? How do you want to live your life? So if you could become a superhero tomorrow, what kind of superpowers would you have? We know once again that giving back leads to healing. And so the idea would be for the client to think about the impact they wish to make in this world. And one of my favorite exercises to do around this is this movie theater exercise. So for the clients to think about, if there is a movie made about you, let's say 10, 15 years from now, and it's called The Story of a Superhero. And it's about you with your origin story and your experiences, but also what you're going to do over the next, let's say, 10 years, and how you're going to impact other people. What would you want this movie to be about then? What would you want these next 10 years to look like? And what would you want the moviegoers to walk away with? How would you want them to be inspired by this? And so these exercises can allow people to think about how they want to be involved with their community. And because it doesn't have to happen overnight, they have 10 or 15 or maybe 20 years to make this a reality, they can start taking small steps now. So I want to end today with a brief case study. This was a client that I was working with, I think about 8 years ago now. We'll call her Lily, but that's not her real name. So Lily's parents brought her in when she was struggling with depression and trauma of bullying. Lily was struggling with self-harm, and she also was struggling with an eating disorder. Lily was about 15, I believe, or 16 around at the time that she started working with me. And she struggled talking about her mental health so much that she would hide behind her father in our sessions, asking him to speak for her. So if I would ask her a question like, what happened this week? What happened in school this week? She would look up to her dad and wait for him to answer. But the one thing she was willing to talk about was her favorite TV show, Veronica Mars. And at this point, I'd never seen Veronica Mars. I'd heard of it. I didn't know what it was about. But Lily kept saying how the character of Veronica Mars is the only one that truly understands her. So I did something I don't always do. I went home and I decided to watch a little bit of the first episode, or at least that's what I intended to do. I accidentally ended up watching the entire season in one night because the show's amazing. And I found out why Lily was so attached to the character of Veronica Mars. Before the show even opens, the character of Veronica Mars had been through every horrific thing that a teenager can go through. She was drugged and sexually assaulted. Her best friend was murdered. Her parents went through a really messy divorce. Her mom was struggling with substance abuse and ran off on the family. And Veronica's boyfriend broke up with her, and all her friends now hate her and bully her. And so Veronica is now not only alone, but lonely in her trauma. And I saw it. I saw Lily. Lily's experiences, the details of her experiences were different, but the loneliness was the same. And as I kept watching, I realized something. So Veronica, the character here, started working with her dad, who is a private investigator. And it turned out that she was really good at being a private investigator herself. She was like a teenage Sherlock Holmes. She started solving cases and helping her community. And it was because of this that her symptoms got better. She formed new friends. By giving back, she made meaning of what happened to her, and her life drastically changed for the better. So realizing this, I went back the following week, and when I saw Lily, I said, I understand why you feel connected to Veronica because of her trauma, but there was something else there. Veronica used something she knew a lot about, which is how to be a detective, to give back to her community. And I think that was really meaningful. So what is something that you know a lot about? And Lily said nothing. I don't know anything about anything. And I said, well, what is something you think a lot about? She said, depression. So I said, is there anyone in your school that is struggling with depression? And she said, well, maybe a couple of students. So I said, what would Veronica do if she knew that there are a couple of people that are struggling with depression? She said, she wouldn't keep silent. She would try to do something. She would maybe make a speech. She would try to help. So this is a girl that was hiding behind her father, right? So I said, is this what you want to do? Do you want to make a speech? And she said, yeah. And so we spent a couple of weeks role playing and rehearsing and embodying Veronica Mars. And then the next time she did it, she went into her class and she asked to make a 5-minute announcement, and her teacher let her. And Lily talked about her experiences with being bullied, with depression, with anxiety, with self-harm, and her eating disorder. And she said the reason why she's making this announcement is because she didn't want anyone else to feel alone if they're going through anything like it. She wanted people to know that she's starting to be better now because she's in therapy. And she wanted to let people know that if they have questions about therapy or how to find a therapist, they could talk to her. Or if they are struggling and they need a friend, they could talk to her. And at the end of that conversation, she was swarmed. Her classmates ran over to her and everyone was sobbing and thanking her and sharing their own stories with her. And by the end of the week, word got out to the whole school and everyone was sharing, and people were sending her messages and stopping her in the hallway. And neither one of us predicted that it would be so big. But what I realized is that the students in her school were so lonely. They needed someone to understand, but they were too afraid to take the first step. And so a couple of months later, Lily started her school's peer support mental health club, where she would meet with students for 1 hour every week, and they would just talk. They would just support one another. And that's the point of this, right? Is that for many of our clients, they feel so alone in their experience that they might not realize that other people are going through it too. But by talking about it, by giving back somehow, they create meaning and they create community. And when they do that, they don't have to go through it alone anymore. And what I wanted to remind you of is that just like some of your clients' favorite heroes, you are the hero to many of them. Many years after you're no longer working with your clients, or many years after you've graduated and are no longer seeing your classmates, there are people who are thinking about you, maybe right now in this moment, who are thinking about something kind that you did. Maybe there's something that they just saw or heard, maybe a song they heard that reminded them of you, but they might not think to tell you this. And so I just wanted to remind you of the tremendous impact that you make in this world. I wanted to remind you that you help other people heal, and that what you do is helping you heal too. And so from the bottom of my heart, thank you for being wonderful. And please keep superheroing and don't forget your cape. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Scarlett. The speech was very powerful, and I think that a lot of clients can definitely use some superhero therapy, myself included. So we are opening up to questions. If anyone has any, we do have just a few minutes left for 1 or 2 questions. But I'm gonna pop in with one while we're waiting for some to submit. For those who perhaps don't have the fandom experience or the background, how would someone start incorporating this
Yeah,
into their practice?
great question. So for a therapist, you mean, who doesn't have fandom experience?
Yes.
I think asking. So I like to ask in a first session after going through the presenting issues. I spend the last 10-15 minutes of my session asking my clients, what kind of things do you like to watch on Netflix or Hulu or YouTube or any of that? What kind of video games do you like to play? What kind of movies or TV shows do you like? And so I just kind of jot that down. And then in the following session, we'll go deeper. So I might say, okay, so you said you like to play Minecraft. Tell me about it. Like, what do you like about this game? Or can you bring in a recording of yourself playing? Or you said that you like WandaVision. What is that? Tell me about this show, right? And so it can really open a conversation. You don't have to know, but by making your client the expert in the room on this topic, I think that you're working together as a team. And I view myself as the sidekick to my client's heroic journey. And so I think it can be really helpful for clients to be in this expert mode.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And do you start off with psychoeducation of the overall plan, or do you kind of just slowly bring them into it?
For me personally, I like to slowly bring people into it unless they specifically request. So some people, of course, like to know sort of what treatment is like and where it's heading. But for the most part, I like to build rapport and trust first. And a lot of times that starts with seemingly meaningless, but I don't think there's such thing as meaningless conversations about favorite TV shows, about video games, about quality time, because it is in those experiences that I think we get to know who our clients are. And very often they're not only playing or watching whatever they're doing to avoid, they're also doing it to connect. And that's where we can catch that.
Thank you so much. We have a attendee who said that there's an organization called Anime for Humanity that provides
I'm
a
familiar
connection
with
to
that.
people who suffer from anxiety. So that's a great resource to explore. What would you suggest on how patients could deal with perpetrators, the people who are providing the anxiety, the ones who are mobbing them at their work, and how could we relate that to it?
Yeah, great question. And I wish we had another hour to talk about this. I think it would start with strength building, emotional strength building, and resilience building in terms of what would your superhero do in this situation? What would Batman do? What would Jessica Jones do? Of course, not inciting violence, right? But in terms of standing up for yourself or other people, what are some safe actions that can be taken? And maybe the person isn't ready for it yet, but it's something that could be role played with that character maybe in your corner in a session. Like if Batman was in your corner when you go to work, what would you be maybe willing to do that maybe you're too overwhelmed to do right now?
Yeah, that makes sense. And we had a question about those who, with clients who have ASD, who have history of becoming too attached or confusing their favorite romantic person as a real person, and how they might bring that up with that form of client because they do get a little hesitant to
Yeah,
bridge that.
makes perfect sense. So one of the things I want to say is I want to be very cautious now because we have -3 minutes, but I wish we could spend another hour just on that. But what I can tell you is this: I think that it's not about making the client see the truth; it's about what is helping them function. And if having a fictional relationship with Batman is helping this person to go to work, fantastic. If having sort of an imaginary romantic relationship with Wonder Woman is helpful for this client to be able to get out of bed in the morning, that's great. I don't know exactly what this looks like for this particular client. And, if at some point you'd like to consult, that's great. I also offer consultations. But I think it's not about binary, this is a good approach, this is a bad approach. I think it's about what is most helpful for this particular person to help them function. For example, for some people, in order to be able to go out into the world, they might need to play 4 hours of a particular game just to emotionally regulate, build up their resiliency, and then be able to do what they're doing. And we saw in the last couple of years just how meaningful gaming had become to help people self-regulate better. And so again, I'd be happy to have a longer conversation about this. Unfortunately, we are out of time, but if any of you would like to consult, please feel free to reach out to me.
Thank you so much. And I do want to just remind everyone, if you are not an ADA member, can we see the right screen? That membership does provide year-long free CE access to webinars such as these, along with great benefits, including peer consultation groups where you can come together to talk about issues. And I would like to invite you to some upcoming webinars, one on avoidant personalities and one on ethics burnout, where you can receive your ethics credits. And I want to thank you all for joining us today. And Dr. Scarlett, thank you so much. It was so wonderful to hear about the incorporation of superhero therapy and how important that these pop culture things can be in healing.
Thank you so much for having me. Have a wonderful day, everyone.
You're
Bye.
welcome. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.